glad to be a part of this, be able to host this second session of race and media in comparative perspectives. And the second session is going to focus on the Spanish Caribbean, specifically Puerto Rico. And our speaker comes to us. She is currently an assistant professor at Indiana University Bloomington, and her areas of interest, while they include race representation, certainly not limited to that, also include Latino theater. And she is here to present on televisual Mestizaje, if my Spanish is correct, representing race and nation in Puerto Rico's commercial television. And so without further ado, if you could join me in giving a round of applause to welcome Dr. Yeidy Rivero.
Very nice. Yeah, I'm not a veteran like Charlie here, so I have to read. But before that, I have to excuse myself. I have a cold because last week I was part of a conference, the Latin American Studies Association conference, which happens in Puerto Rico. And exactly a week ago on Friday, they usually have a dance. So I went to the dance, and from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., I was talking about the current state of Latin American media. In other words, I was not dancing, I was not sweating, I was not drinking, I was not smoking, I was talking about academic stuff. And because of that, I have a cold. So sorry. In other words, if you want to have fun, go to LASA. And thank you again. Thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this presentation. Last November, I received an email from a SUNY Albany student who, to protect his identity, I will refer to as Willie. Willie had just finished reading my book for a course in communication research methods, and he sent me an email to let me know that the book touched him on a personal level. As a Black Latino young man born to Dominican parents in Puerto Rico and raised in New York, his ethnic identity had been a source of contestation. According to him, as a result of what he described as his, quote, darker hue, end of quote, Latinos were usually shocked when they heard him speaking in Spanish because they assumed he was African American. By reading Willie as African American, these Latinos and Latinas apparently reproduce the U.S. black and white racial binary in which blackness is equivalent to African Americanness, while also merging the Latino-Hispanic ethnic identity with either brownness or whiteness, not blackness. Thus, Willie wanted to thank me for, quote, focusing on a controversial topic that many do not address within the Latino community, end of quote. I begin with this personal anecdote, not only because Willie's words have been one of the most rewarding aspects of my short academic career, and there are not many, rewarding aspects in academia, sadly. Sorry, graduate students. Welcome to reality. Reality check 101. But also because his email brings to the forefront two issues that motivated my research. First, how has the ideology of Mestizaje, which highlights the egalitarian fusion of European, African, and indigenous cultures and people, cloaked the privileging of whiteness and promoted anti-Black racism in Puerto Rico? And second, how has the nurturing of whiteness and anti-Black racism permeated Puerto Rico's commercial television representation of the nation, its culture, and its racially diverse citizens? Today, I will present an overview of the main themes that I discuss in Tuning Out Blackness by first focusing on the general topics that have characterized television research in Latin America, and then moving to the particular themes discussed in each of the book's chapters. I will end my talk by briefly discussing another personal anecdote as a way of clarifying the motivations that shape my scholarly work. Although in recent years, globalization has developed into a hotly debated topic within the public discourse, since the late 1960s, scholars focusing on communication and media in Latin America have been discussing the impact of state government control and local versus global, predominantly U.S., economic forces in the development of television across the region. the theoretical paradigms utilized to examine the privately owned and free market television structures, the regional programming flows, and the political, economic, and social complexities of the region have ranged from dependency and cultural imperialism theory to multiple proximities theory to theories of globalization. Furthermore, beginning in the late 1980s, some scholars have embarked on research that examines the hybridity that is part of Latin American and Spanish Caribbean cultures and media cultures. More recently, the topic of U.S. Spanish language television and media has occupied the pages of U.S., European, and Latin American academic journals, due in part to the financial success and rapid expansion of U.S.-based, and with one exception, all transnationally owned corporations such as Univision, Galavisión, Telemundo, and Azteca America. These networks and cable station business achievements relate in part to the expeditious growth of the U.S. Hispanic Latino population, which, according to the 2000 U.S. Census, has become the nation's largest minority group. However, the success of these networks is also a product of their shrewd business practices. Contrary to U.S. television networks that, for the most part, broadcast shows produced in the U.S., U.S. Spanish language television networks relied on inexpensive Latin American programming to fill out their primetime schedules. As of 2005, the major exporters of this programming are Mexico, and to a much lesser extent, Brazil, Venezuela, and Colombia. Given these transnational exchanges, media scholars have concentrated their academic writings on the industrial commercial practices that characterize television importations and exportations across Latin America and the U.S. Whereas the aforementioned academic exploration have enhanced our understanding of globalization by focusing on the political economy of the Latin American U.S. mediascape, my work attempts to contribute to this area of ongoing research by bringing to the forefront the marginalization of non-white citizens in Puerto Rican media cultures, and also by raising questions about the relevance of maintaining local sites of television production. Thus, besides examining the representations of and dialogues on Blackness in Puerto Rico's commercial television, Tuning Out Blackness poses two central questions. First, what are the cultural, ethnic, racial, political, and economic repercussions of having all commercial shows exported from a foreign country? And second, how does the emergence of an increasingly monolithic trans-Latin American, U.S. Hispanic, Eurocentric, and whitened televisual world affect Black and indigenous population in Latin America? Additionally, the book problematizes the absence of Puerto Rico in U.S. and Latin American television studies and contends that the island's political status as a U.S. territory and the cultural definition of Puerto Rico as a Spanish Caribbean Latin American nation have been influential in the non-existent and thus ambiguous location of Puerto Rico in both literatures. By considering the highly complex relations between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, the Federal Communications Commission regulations, the appropriation and indigenization of both U.S. and Latin American programming concepts, and the cultural exchanges between Puerto Rican and Latin American media professionals, I define Puerto Rico's commercial television as an in-between mediatic bridge. This in-between mediatic bridge, and more importantly, the island's intricate national, political, social, and cultural colonial place played a central role in the construction of and dialogues on Blackness from the 1940s to the 1990s. This research not only led me to complicate the cultural imperialism paradigm that has characterized the limited literature on Puerto Rican television, but it also forced me to rethink the relationship between Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, and the ways in which particular conditions outside the broadcasting industry influence embodiments of and debates on Blackness in specific historical moments. Thus, each chapter is devoted to a time period, 1940s, 1950s, 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, and presents a historical and cultural contextualization of particular radio and television Black performances, taking into account the actors, performers, the industry and producers, texts, reviews of the characters and shows, and sociocultural, economic, and political transformations. The first stagings of blackness in Puerto Rico's commercial media were not influenced by the US, as many might be led to believe, but instead were a product of the cultural exchanges between Cuba and Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rican playwrights and performers' translation of Cuba's Bufo theater tradition to Puerto Rico's culture. And I can explain Bufo theater. It's very, people usually compare it to US minstrelsy, and at the end I can talk more about it. The existing literature on Puerto Rican 19th century theater documents this connection. When I began to read 1940s and 1950s radio scripts and plays written by Ramón Rivero Diplo, the most famous blackface and black voice actor in Puerto Rican history, and when I listened to the available radio recordings, I realized that Rivero's black voice and blackface characters were adaptations of Bufo's Negrito Catedrático type. In Bufo theater, the Negrito Catedrático was constructed as an arrogant black man who tried unsuccessfully to use bourgeois intellectual vocabulary as a way of placing himself within Cuban white society. In some ways, the Negrito Catedrático can be compared to the US Sip Kun urban dandy stereotype that was part of minstrelsy, and the representations and mockeries of blacks imitating whites. Nonetheless, in several Bufo plays, the Negrito Catedrático became the most astute of the traditional Bufo characters, and the other characters were the Gallego, Galician man, and La Mulata, was the sexualized figure. During the 1868 Bufomania, which coincided with Cuba's fight for its independence from Spain, the Negritos rearticulated an anti-colonial political and cultural ideology, first against the Spanish government, and later, after 1895, against US interventions in Cuba. It is precisely this anti-colonial ideological construction of blackness that created a space for political and contradictory negritos in the artistic work of Ramón Rivero, a man who was part of Puerto Rico's nationalistic movement, who openly embraced a pro-independent ideology, and who was actively involved in Puerto Rico's labor movement. Thus, through what I define as Cuban and Puerto Rican, and it's because he had a Cuban accent even though he was talking about Puerto Rico in his performances, Cuban Rican blackface and black voice characters, Rivero created a space for criticism of working class subjugation and US colonialism. In the process, the charismatic Rivero normalized blackface as a symbol for the marginal sectors of the Puerto Rican population from the late 1940s to the mid-1950s. And I'm going to show a clip, and it's in Spanish, and it's a compilation just for you to see how he looked. So this is the Negrito character, like one of the, like, Diplo. And these are some commercials that he did. And there was, the narrations is in Spanish, that's why it's lower. Okay. During the 1950s and 1960s, Puerto Rico's commercial television depictions of blackness were contained within 3 specific televisual locations: variety shows, comedies, and telenovelas. In other words, the 1950s was seminal in terms of the representations of blackness that were going to continue throughout the years. First, the variety shows, one of the most popular genres in Puerto Rican television since its beginning in 1954, and actually variety genre is very popular in Latin America in general, Latin American television, integrated Afro-Puerto Rican cultural traditions and bands comprised of black and mulatto musicians, while at the same time including numerous blackface characters. Secondly, the locally produced comedies presented a few black actors and actresses alongside white actors in blackface. Third, the telenovelas were dominated by white actors and actresses, some of whom, specifically actresses, perform in blackface. Thus, as these performances of blackness indicate, racial representation was complicated not only by the ongoing use of blackface, but also by the limited opportunities available to black actors and actresses in Puerto Rico. By the 1970s, however, a number of national and international developments influenced how blackness was staged in Puerto Rican commercial television. The 1960s, 1970s civil rights movement and Black Power movement, the Cuban Revolution, the reinvigoration of the Puerto Rican left, and the influence of U.S. and global alternative political, social, sexual, and cultural practices partially altered televisual performances of blackness during the 70s. Even more critical was the mobilization of black actors and actresses who protested stereotypical images in local productions, calling into questions the white ideological normativity that informed the industry and that defined the televisual image of the Puerto Rican people. And when I was doing my research, let me tell you, nobody has mentioned anything about this mobilization, the black actors protesting blackface. For me, was amazing, looking at, newspaper clips and magazines. They were very, very active, and when they did, they appropriated the discourse of the civil rights movement and Black Power movement. So it was very interesting. Within the context of these broad national and international movements, I explored several key televisual and media moments in the 1970s that pushed the question of racial identity into the Puerto Rican mainstream. I examined the debate surrounding a television performer who wore an afro, programs that directly and indirectly dealt with blackness, the renewed popularity of blackface, black actors and actresses' protests against racism, and the selection of a mulata as Miss World Puerto Rico. Although initially, the translations of alternative political, social, and cultural discourses and practices and the indigenization of U.S. black-oriented programming concepts destabilized the whiteness that characterized local television, blackface was ultimately reinstated as a protected masquerade for social criticism. In other words, similar to Rivero's 1940s, 1950s blackface and black voice characters, a female character, a black female character, a negrita, became the televisual voice for the working class. And I'm going to show a clip of the... Okay. I don't know where it is. No, it was ready.
Yeah. Interesting.
Where? Oh. Okay, the difference between this character and the previous blackface character is that this actress adapted. It was like the last transformation of Bufo theater. She created a jíbara, and jíbara is a peasant, Puerto Rican peasant, and it's the symbol of Puerto Ricanness. So there are no traces of Cubanness in her representation of blackface. Okay, and this character became in 1973. She was part of a telenovela in 1973. It was so popular that had her own show until 1985. She continued performing. Okay. Okay, whereas Rivero's blackface character embodied a Cuban Rican blackness, the 1970s blackface characters were distinctively Puerto Rican. This transformation generally reflected the emerging prejudice against Cuban immigrants who had come in mass after 1959, the 1959 Cuban Revolution, and were quickly accused of taking jobs away from Puerto Ricans. Although television served as a clearly ethnocentric source for criticizing the Cuban migration, the Cuban presence within the industry was extensive. Thus, in the book, I analyzed the participation of Cubans in Puerto Rico's commercial television production processes, the predominance in the area of script writing, and the construction of Cubans in locally produced entertainment programming. I pay special attention to the highly successful 1981-1991 locally produced situation comedy Los Suegros, The In-Laws, which centered on a Puerto Rican couple and a Cuban couple who became family members when their respective daughter and son married. As seen through the narrative rearticulation of Puerto Rican-Cuban tensions after the 1959 migration, by the 1980s, Cubans were televisually portrayed as ambivalent welcome members in Puerto Rican society and the national family. This representation of Puerto Ricans and Cubans as family members reasserted the alleged whiteness of these two ethnic groups and discursively transferred blackness to the new anti-modern, undesirable, and foreign group in Puerto Rico, the Dominicans. During the mid-1970s throughout the 1980s, the socially constructed and unwanted blackness began to be associated with the Dominican Republic and its citizens, especially those migrating illegally to Puerto Rico. While Puerto Rican blacks and mulattoes continued to be marginalized, the strongest prejudice was and continues to be targeted to Dominicans, a migrant group that, contrary to the Cuban diaspora in Puerto Rico, does not possess economic and symbolic power. This social, cultural, and ethnic substitution of otherness, together with the U.S. and global commercial success of black-oriented situation comedies during the 80s, created a space for Puerto Rican blacks in the television situation comedy world. On one level, as I previously observed, blackness in Puerto Rico's national imaginary became analogous to Dominicans. On another level, U.S. black situation comedies such as The Jefferson and The Cosby Show, which articulated U.S. dominant discourses of whiteness, middle-class status, and social mobility, became highly popular television shows capturing diverse racial, ethnic, and class segments of the U.S. television audience. These distinct social, cultural, racial, and media factors intertwined with the ideology of racial unity ingrained in Puerto Rico's culture, transformed the local commercial television's racial depiction of a black Puerto Rican fictional family in the 1990s. My last case study focuses on the 1994-2003 situation comedy Mi Familia, My Family, and examines the incorporation of black Puerto Ricans into the previously predominantly white situation comedy genre. From the initial conceptualization of Mi Familia, the media professionals involved in the production processes downplayed the fictional family's race, blackness. Although the show's text rearticulated ideologies of racial and cultural mestizaje and never problematized the island's racist ideologies, this cultural product reconfigured the local television family sitcom genre and reinstated black and mulatto members as part of the Puerto Rican and televisual ethnic family. And maybe I will show a clip at the end if we have time. Nonetheless, the increased black televisual invisibility that seemed to mark a new era in Puerto Rican television may be undone by recent changes in the local television landscape. Throughout the 80s, every commercial station in Puerto Rico became part of U.S. and multinational conglomerates. Additionally, and interrelated to these transformations, since the 1980s, the production of local programming has gradually decreased. Although according to some television professionals, local businesses group were interested in buying WKAQ, either WKAQ or WAPA, the most profitable stations in Puerto Rico, these stations were sold at, quote, exorbitantly high prices, end of quote, and local groups, quote, could not compete with the offers made by U.S. media conglomerates, end of quote. Presently, three major commercial stations operate in Puerto Rico: WKAQ TV Telemundo, part of Telemundo's network, which is owned by NBC, WAPA TV Televicentro, owned by LIM Television, and Tele 11, bought by Univision Network in 2001. Before the arrival of Univision, all the stations function as semi-independent entities. They establish commercial autonomy through business arrangement with independent producers, programming selection, audience viewing measurements, and sponsors. However, this semi-independent business practice is being radically altered by Univision. The Univision Puerto Rico station, contrary to Telemundo Puerto Rico and Televicentro, operates as a network, a totally new business entity in Puerto Rico's television market. it is difficult to predict the future of Puerto Rico's commercial television. Nevertheless, based on recent changes, the island seems to be rapidly moving toward becoming part of the U.S. Hispanic market. For example, performers who formerly worked in Puerto Rican telenovelas were recruited to be part of Univision pan-ethnic morning program produced in Miami. Some Puerto Rican comedians were hired to participate in Univision's Miami-based productions and then were required to eliminate vernacular Puerto Rican phrases and words from their acts in order to appeal to the U.S. Mexican majority within the Hispanic television market. A token Puerto Rican actress was hired by Televisa Mexico to participate in their telenovelas, which were then broadcast on Univision, and she substituted her Puerto Rican accent for a Mexican one. Miami, as John Sinclair writes regarding U.S. Spanish language television, is the place of, quote, exchanges between American continents, a space of production as well as distribution and distribution of programs as well as of signals, end of quote. However, through the Univision Miami signal, primetime Hispanic television is dominated by Mexican imports. The in-between U.S. Latin American cultural space that has characterized Puerto Rico's commercial television since the 50s could become a cultural place where the local may cease to exist. If Puerto Rico's television professionals are able to travel on what would be a new and exclusively one-way mediatic bridge, they will have to produce, write, direct, and perform television artifacts with generic pan-ethnic phrases and decenter social, political, cultural, gendered, and racial meanings disconnected from the local. What is more, if Puerto Rico becomes Hispanic, audiences will consume a predominantly white televisual world. Therefore, all the struggles that Black Puerto Rican performers endured to have a place for translating Blackness in the local televisual landscape might soon become anecdotes from the past. Consequently, directly and indirectly and throughout the entire book, I ask, what happens when the entire televisual world represents a sociopolitical, cultural, and ethnic landscape which has no connection with the local? What are the repercussions of having communicative spaces which do not address national debates? What happens to the local when there are no laws to restrain the importation of programs and when media professionals are at the mercy of global economic and media flows? The answers to these questions are the future of Puerto Rico's commercial television and actually Panama and all the small television markets in Latin America. I should admit that these questions, which actually reflect the present state of Puerto Rican television, are very depressing for me. One thing that I have not mentioned, but Yeidy actually included in the flyer, is that I studied a BA in theater, and as a result, many of the currently unemployed actors and media professionals were colleagues, and some are close friends. Additionally, during my research process, I had the chance to meet many of the people who work all their lives in the industry, and who, due to the decrease of local productions, migrated to New York City, Miami, and Los Angeles in the 80s. For instance, in Los Angeles, I spent many hours with Lillian Hurst, a Puerto Rican actress and producer who began working in Puerto Rico's commercial television in 1960 and who, because of unemployment, left the island in the mid-1980s. Lillian, nonetheless, has done fairly well in comparison to other actors and media professionals who migrated in the 80s. You can see Lillian in the reruns of Dharma and Greg, where she played the maid, in the movie Orange County, where she played the maid, in the short-lived comedies The Comeback and Cracking Up, where she played the maid, and most recently in some of the flashbacks in Lost, where she plays the mom of one of the stranded survivors. Financially speaking, being a maid on television pays very well. Lillian even has a BMW that talks to you. However, as she has expressed to me, she's not happy. Seeing an older woman in the twilight of her career, who once was a well-respected theater and TV actress, crying in front of you because she wants to live and work in Puerto Rico is unsettling. Hence, when I read recently published academic articles that focus on trans-Latin American media flows and celebrate how Mexican telenovelas surpass U.S. programming, without considering how these media exchanges have affected small television markets and the people who work in the industry, I am left speechless. Or when I see that scholars do not pay attention to television, racial, ethnic, cultural, and gendered representations across the Latin American and the Spanish Caribbean region, or document the ways in which non-white citizens are and have been coping with their social and television marginalization, I have wondered if I have lived all my life in an alternative universe like those depicted on Star Trek. Thank you.